Hiya gang, so today we're doing another water tutorial. We're going to submerge this fish. It's a deepkin fish. I painted it a while ago, but we're going to use it today. We're going to use the same UV resin and the blue light as the last one. The only difference here is you're going to want to find yourself a plastic container of some sort, so I'm going to use this plastic cover from a notebook that I have. I'm just going to cut it off real quick. So I'm just going to eyeball the height of what I need the tube to be, just a little bit taller than the fish if the plastic goes pretty much all the way down to the bottom of the base. If you don't want the resin to enclose the base as well, then obviously make a smaller tube. You'll just have to pad it with blue tack around the bottom to ensure that it doesn't leak, because the texture on the base is a little wonky. To make the tube fit itself, I ended up just coiling it round and making a little slice where I wanted it to meet. So my piece of plastic was a little dirty, so I gave it a little rinse with some methylated spirits just to get some glue off that I'd spilt on previously and a bit of paint. So I mentioned that there were two methods of doing this. They have their own pros and cons and uses that you would use them for. We're going to do a full tube of resin. So we're filling the entire tube solid, having a solid brick of resin at the end. This is good for if you don't have any other walls around the resin, because the other option that you could do is if you only need one corner or one wall of resin, I recommend to just create a bath type thing. So you want to make a tub out of the plasticard with a ceiling. This uses a lot less resin for a start, so it's relatively easier to manage doing, but you want to create that ceiling. So you can create whatever scenario you want underwater with like fish and those things. Just make it as you normally would in like a diorama. But then you want to give it a ceiling, and then we will be building the resin on top of that ceiling. So any ripples or splashes that you want, you can still make. It'll just be on top of a ceiling. This will also help with weight. If you're traveling with your minis, you don't necessarily want a kilo of solid resin in your bag. So by making a hollow tub with a ceiling with a thin layer of resin for your splashes and your ripples, this weighs a lot less. This is a lot easier to carry around, and it's a lot safer for your display cases rather than trying to judge whether your display case will hold 3 kilos of resin. So to create the tube, I recommend getting some masking tape to stick the two ends of the plastic together. You want to try and line it up as best you can. It took me a couple of goes, but in the end I did get a flat join. This is just so when you do put it over, it does have that flat bottom edge. Just checking to see if it still fits. So now to seal the edge of the plastic tube, I am just using a brush to add some resin just to keep it closed. I would recommend leaving the tape on while it sets. I did take it off. I feel like I probably shouldn't have, and it wouldn't have leaked as much as it did. I did get quite a few air bubbles while it was setting. So you just want to set this with your blue light, give it a couple of minutes. I've sped it up. At this point, it doesn't matter if this resin is messy, because as soon as you put more resin on top of it, it's going to go see-through. So it's going to hide itself. This is where I took the tape off around the edge. I would recommend not doing this, just leave it on for as long as possible, because I did get that nook coming back because the resin wasn't quite enough to hold it super stiff, where the tape would have helped with that. And now I'm putting it on the mini, and I'm just gonna make sure that it doesn't have too many gaps and that it is flat around the bottom. I have left it with about 1 millimeter of base sticking out around the bottom just because the base is flared, so it can form a plug quite well. So now you just want to chuck your resin in. I wasn't particularly careful doing this. You do want to try and not get air bubbles if you don't want any. If you do want air bubbles, then do whatever. If you don't want air bubbles, I would recommend doing this slowly, doing it layer by layer, just building it up. So now my fish is completely coated and I am fairly happy with it. If I had left the tape on previously, I probably wouldn't have done this, but if you are worried about bits leaking or bits already leaking, chuck some more tape on it, it'll be fine. Or blue tack. Blue tack works as well. So now I'm just going around with the torch around the base of the Mini, just because a bit of resin did come out. It always comes out the bottom just a little bit, so I always go around it with the torch just to set it, to stick it all together. So I left it with the torch on for a bit so the top would set. So here you can see I can pick it up and sort of wobble it around, and it's kind of fine. The top is set, it's not leaking out anywhere. This is good. If it is leaking anywhere at this point, just add some more blue tack, fill in some little gaps with tape, that kind of thing. And then you're gonna wanna leave it to set a bit more. So here I do have some quite big air bubbles. I didn't intend for them, but they don't look terrible, because it is a fish, it is water, it's gonna have some air bubbles in it. This is quite a big one. If you did want to get rid of this, I would recommend getting a small drill and just drilling from the top, because the top is already solid set. And then the resin should fill itself back in, and then the drill hole will just disappear once we do the top and add some more resin on top. This is at 750% speed. I left it like this for a very long time, just to make sure that it was set all the way through. See here, you can see where it's leaking the air in with the extra bubbles. I did leave it, I should have been watching it, but if I was watching it, I would have sealed that hole with some blue tack so it didn't let in so much air. So this is from the side. I arranged the bubbles as much as I could, kind of lava lampy, and I turned it on its side so they would stay where I wanted them to be and not float to the top, and I just left it in front of the torch again for another couple of minutes just to make it super solid. So this is what it looks like after it's set. The bubbles are not moving, they are completely still. That's a good way of seeing if it's set, having a couple of bubbles in there, just to see if you can wobble them around a bit still. So now I'm just gonna peel off the plastic. It should just come away super easy. It's not stuck to anything, it's just the resin, and the resin shouldn't have stuck to it. So now you can see that there is that ridge at the back. We are gonna have to trim that. We're also gonna trim the top to make it more flat so we can work with it. So I'm just taking my scalpel and we're just gonna cut off the excess that we don't want, starting with the bit on the top, and then I'm gonna go down the side, flatten that out. You will see that when you are cutting it, or if you're sanding it, you will see when you are cutting it or sanding it that it is going to leave a frosty line where you've cut it. Just ignore it. Put a bit of resin over it, put a bit of varnish over it, and it'll disappear. So you just want to get the top as flat as possible so you can use it as the surface for what we're going to do next. Now you can add splashes, you can add ripples, you can add air bubbles, but it is easier if you keep the top as flat as possible. I would recommend sanding it. I didn't, because I'm lazy, but I do recommend sanding it. It's also recommended to not cut towards yourself. It's a very bad habit that I have, but I do it anyway. So here we're going to start building up the bubbles. There are a fair few bubbles in the tube itself, so I'm fairly happy with doing some bubbles with ripples on top. I'm going to grab some of these caviar beads. They're called caviar beads, they're little glass beads. You can get them from Amazon or nail beauty shops. They're for nail art. They're very cheap to get, just a massive packet of 1,000 or so of them. And we're just gonna chuck them on top as little air bubbles. We're gonna stick them down with the resin, and I'm gonna show you a couple of tricks on how to work with the resin to create a nice water texture on top. So we're gonna start making a very thin puddle of resin that we can stick the beads into. Just drag it out to cover the rim where we've cut it. If there are bubbles, use a pin to get them out, or just give it a couple of taps on the table. Now we're gonna take our little beads, our little caviar balls, and I'm just gonna randomly place them on top as if they are bubbles coming up from below. They are clear glass, so once they are in, the bit underneath the resin should be more transparent, so they should blend in quite well and not look like beads in resin. As you can already see, the resin has started building up around the edge of the beads, giving it that extra light reflection on the top. We're gonna wanna exaggerate that, so the best way to do that is to lightly dry the resin, not so it's completely set, but just so the top skin is set, so then you can still move it around. If you need to add more resin, do that. I do that eventually, but I just want to grab the end of a paintbrush or something that won't stick to the resin, and I'm just basically creating circles around the bubbles, just moving the resin around to give it those ripple-like movement into it. So here I'm just adding some extra resin because the resin I did was a little thin. I'm gonna build it up around the edges, slowly drying it where I need it to be more dry and not letting it completely set so I can still maneuver it around with the brush. You can take as long or as short amount of time on this as you want. I took quite a while doing this just because I wanted to get it as textured as I could, just so I could show what it looks like. In the light, you can see the texture that I've created, and I will keep building it up for a little while just to get it at that like min-max excessive texture that I enjoy. I do recommend using the end of a paintbrush, or if you need something smaller, because you've done a lot of bubbles near each other, the head of a pin works very well. If you have any glass bead ended pins for dressmaking, they are also very good for this. So this technique is quite versatile. If you were doing ripples, for example, or trying to create a wake behind a plane or a boat on some water, you can use this method to quite easily lay some resin down and then use either some plastic card like we made the tube with to create a more funnel shaped wake, or you can just use the end of a brush or whatever you want essentially to create whatever texture you want. I will be covering making splashes and those sort of features in the next tutorial, but just for this one we're just going to do some simple ripples with some bubble. So like I said before, on the edge where we did cut it away, we're just going to put an extra little bit of resin on top and it will make it essentially invisible. I do use my finger to smooth it down. Be careful of spreading it too much over the sides and you might make a mess, and then just set it to dry and you'll have a seamless tube with some bubbles on top. So there you are, we are done with the resin. We're now going to move on to some paint. So the most recommended white paint is Pro Acryl Bold Titanium White. If you don't have this or don't have access to it, it's kind of difficult to get here in the UK. You can use Citadel Corex White, just be aware that it is a little more grey, it is a little more dulled down. I am going to use the Corex White for this, just to keep all my tutorials using one brand of paint so it's not too confusing to follow along. I'm going to take my tiny brush and we're just going to paint on some of the ripples. So if you've seen water before, I'm going to assume you've seen water before. When it creates the ripples, at the top there's a little bit of aeration in the water, there's a bit of froth. It's going to have some white color to it. It's not a color, but like, it's gonna have a white texture. We're gonna paint that on. I'm gonna use a little stippling motion with my tiny brush, do some little circles around my bubbles, and just kind of skip between drawing lines and stipples. If you want your water to look more violent, then use more white. If you want your water to be more calm and still, then use less or don't do this at all. So when I'm painting these on, I am holding the resin tube against the lamp sometimes just to see where the light is reflecting, so I can paint those on and capture those moments. And then sometimes the air bubbles will have their own line around them just to distinguish them from the rest of the water. So I just do that quickly. You don't have to do this. And I paint on some highlight reflection marks on top of the bubbles as well. These last two things are more like cartoony add-ons. You don't need to do them. It looks good without them. It looks good with them. Depends on what you're going for. And then I just put some random stipples on top, just as little tiny air bubbles just coming up. So this is the finished look. The top is now quite wavy with the bubbles. It looks quite nice, and the fish is quite happily swimming in his little lake. I didn't color the resin, so it's very clear. You can add ink or contrasts to the resin to make it more murky, like a dirty pond or river. I kept it quite clear just for simplicity. You can add whatever you want. I would recommend doing what we did in the swamp tutorial and swirling in some color if you're going to. I think it looks slightly nicer than completely mixing the resin to create one solid color. As always, the Discord and the stream links are in the description, and some extra information about how I did this, if you need it written down, is also in the description. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope this helped. If you've never used resin before, let me know how it goes, and I'll see you next time.